A silver machine worth $3 million sits dead in the parking lot, and the man they call a janitor is walking toward it. Nobody moves. The engineers who built it couldn't wake it. The CEO is laughing. The cruel kind of laughing, the kind that says, fix it. And it's yours because he knows it can't be done, except the old man in the Navy uniform has seen this machine before. Not on paper. In his dreams. In a life he buried 20 years ago behind a door he nailed shut with his own hands. His fingers touch the wiring like he's touched it 1,000 times. Watch the CEO's face. Watch the laughter start to die. Because the thing about a man the world decides not to see is that he sees everything. Every wire. Every lie. Every debt that was never paid. And he remembers. He remembers all of it. The sun hadn't climbed over the city yet when Solomon Reed pushed through the service door of Halcyon Systems. 40 stories of glass above him. Still dark. Still sleeping. He liked it this way. Before the world woke up and decided not to see him. Solomon was 58. His beard had gone the color of ash at the edges, neat trimmed close against dark skin that had weathered more winters than most of the men upstairs had years. He moved slow, not because he was old, because slow was how you got things right. The security guard at the desk looked up and smiled, and that smile was real. "Morning, Solomon. You beat the sun again." "Only way to catch it," Solomon said, and that was the whole conversation. But it was more than most people gave him in a week. He changed in the small locker room, hanging his worn coat on the same hook it had lived on for years. Slipped into the Navy uniform. The name patch on his chest read one word. Solomon. No last name. As if a last name was something a man in his position hadn't earned. As if half of him had been left at the door. He didn't complain. He gathered his cart. By 6:30, he'd already fixed 3 things that weren't his to fix. A flickering light on the 18th floor that had been driving a woman in accounting half crazy for a month. The work order was filed. Nobody came. So Solomon came. Replaced the ballast with hands that remembered 1,000 smaller stranger machines. A printer on 22 that 2 technicians had declared dead. Solomon looked at it for maybe 10 seconds. Saw the bent sliver of metal riding just out of true. One press of a screwdriver. Alive again. He left no note, took no credit. That wasn't the point. Because the point was this. Somewhere in the quiet of a building that would never know his name, things worked because he had touched them. And that was enough. Most days. Most days. Then there was the photograph. It lived in his wallet, soft at the corners from being carried so long. 2 young men in front of a garage, arms around each other, grinning like the whole future belonged to them. One of them was Solomon, a lifetime ago before the gray. The other was Marcus. Marcus who had his brother's quick hands and his brother's stubborn heart. Marcus who was gone. Solomon didn't look at it long. He never did. He touched the edge of it with one thumb, the way you'd touch a scar to remember. It was healed, and he put it away, and he went back to work. By 9, the building had filled. Engineers with coffee. Analysts in pressed suits. They flowed around Solomon like water around a stone. Not unkind, just unaware. He had become part of the architecture. A potted plant. An exit sign. A thing your eye slides past. I didn't mind. He'd made peace with invisible. He thought he had. Then Weston Hale arrived, and the whole lobby changed temperature. Weston was 43, and dressed like it cost money to prove it. The suit, the haircut that looked careless and wasn't. He came through the doors talking into his phone, loud the way mustn't talk when they've never once worried about being overheard. I don't care about the supply chain. I told the board a prototype by quarter's end, and I meant it. Solomon was mopping near the private elevator. He moved his cart aside, made himself small. An old habit, a survival skill. And Weston, eyes on his screen, stepped straight into the wet floor. His Italian shoe skated. His arms went out, and Solomon's hand, shot forward on pure instinct, closed around the man's elbow and held him upright. For 1 second, they were closer than either of them wanted to be. The CEO and the janitor breathing the same air. Weston pulled back, straightened his jacket like Solomon's touch had left a mark. His eyes flicked over the older man. Something moved behind them. Not gratitude. Something closer to annoyance that the moment had happened at all. "Watch where you're cleaning," Weston said. "Just doing my job, sir." Weston's mouth twisted. "Yeah, stay in your lane." The elevator swallowed him. The doors closed. And Solomon stood there with his mop and the small, familiar sting of it. The sting he'd learned to breathe through. In, out. Let it go. He was very good at letting it go. Later that morning, he was replacing a bulb on the 12th floor when the elevator button caught his eye. The up button, torn open, wires exposed. Somebody had tried to fix it and made it so much worse. Solomon set down his tools, opened his pouch. Inside a small soldering kit older than most of the people in this building. His hands knew what to do before his mind finished asking. 5 minutes. That was all it took. A steady hand and 5 minutes. The button glowed, the elevator chimed, and a young woman stepped out and stopped cold staring at him. Her badge read Priya Deshmukh, and under that one word that explained the mess and the hurry, both intern. Dark hair pulled back, sharp eyes behind round glasses, the kind of eyes that actually looked. "Did you just fix that?" she said. Solomon shrugged, already reaching for his cart. Simple wiring. Maintenance said it needed a part. Next week. 2 engineers gave up on it this morning. Sometimes things just need a gentle touch. And he wheeled away before she could ask the question, forming on her face. Because he could see it forming. Because he'd seen that look before, years ago, on students who were about to realize their teacher knew more than the syllabus said. And he did not want to be seen that way. Not anymore. "Thank you," Priya called after him. He lifted a hand without turning. Kept walking. There was one person in the building who saw him whole. Her name was Odessa Boyd, and she ran the cafeteria kitchen with the authority of a woman who had fed thousands and taken sass from none of them. She was near his age, steel in her hair and warmth in her hands. And every single day, when the lunch rush thinned, she set aside the last good piece of cornbread and slid it across the counter to him. "Solomon Reed," she said. Full name. Always the full name. Like it mattered. Like he mattered. "You look like a man carrying something today. Aren't we all, Odessa?" She wasn't fooled. She was never fooled. Some carry it lighter. He sat. He ate her cornbread, which was the best thing that happened to him most days, and he let the noise of the room wash over him, and for a few minutes he was just a man having lunch with a friend. No uniform, no patch, just Solomon. It was the closest thing to being known that he let himself have. Then Friday came, and Friday broke the quiet open. Weston Hale's prototype car wouldn't start. It sat in the executive space, a sleek silver thing that had cost more than most people, here made in a decade hood up, surrounded by a knot of engineers who all wore the same expression. The expression of people who had run out of ideas. Weston paced beside it, face flushed, voice rising. You're telling me none of you can figure out a car that you designed? Sir, the diagnostics are throwing multiple errors. Then it's garbage. He kicked the front tire. 3 years and it can't even turn over. Solomon was sweeping the walk nearby. Not close. Just close enough. And he watched. And something old stirred in his chest because he knew that car. Not the way you know a thing you own. The way you know a thing you dreamed about before anyone else did. Weston caught him looking, and a cruel little idea lit up the CEO's face. Hey, genius. His voice carried, meant to make the whole lot turn and watch. You think you can do better than my engineers? He gestured at the dead machine, grinning now. Tell you what, fix it, and the car's yours. Someone laughed. Someone always laughs. Right, a voice muttered, like the janitor's gonna solve it. Solomon stood very still, his broom in his weathered hands, the morning cold on his neck. He could have kept sweeping. All those years of keeping sweeping. That was the safe thing. The invisible thing. But there was that car. And there was that word in Weston's mouth, genius, thrown like a rock. So he leaned the broom against a planter, and he walked toward the machine. The engineers parted uncertain. Weston folded his arms, that smug smile, already rehearsing the humiliation to come. Solomon bent over the open compartment. His eyes moved across the wiring, the junction boxes, the architecture of a thing he understood in his bones. His fingers traced a path only he could see. He tapped a junction, twice, adjusted 2 connections that had been seated wrong, stepped back. Try it now, he said. Quiet, almost gentle. Weston rolled his eyes, but he pressed the fob. The car woke. A low, healthy hum. The dashboard bloomed green. The whole thing came alive under a touch that had taken all of 30 seconds. And then, silence. The kind of silence that has weight, that presses on the ears. Every face in that parking lot frozen, and none more frozen than Weston Hale's, whose laughter had died somewhere in his throat and never made it out. Solomon nodded once, to no one in particular. Just needed the right touch. He walked back to his broom, picked it up, kept sweeping like nothing at all had happened. But everything had. Because near the entrance, half-hidden, Priya Deshmukh had her phone raised. And it was recording. And it had caught all of it. Weston finally found his voice, and it came out small and mean. Lucky guess. Loose connection. Something simple. The engineers said nothing. They knew better. The diagnostics had shown a dozen critical failures. Nothing about it had been simple. Nothing. And as the crowd broke apart, whispering, Weston Hale turned to get one more look at the man who had just made a fool of him without saying more than 6 words. His eyes found Solomon's back bent over the broom patient, and unbothered. And in his frustration, Weston said a thing he shouldn't have. Half to himself, half a threat. Should have stayed at Meridian Dynamics, where nobody'd ever hear from you again. Solomon stopped. Just for a breath. Just for one single breath, the broom went still in his hands. Because Meridian Dynamics was a name he had buried. A name with his brother's blood on it. A name no one in this building should have known to say. And Weston Hale had just said it like he'd always known. Solomon didn't turn around. He made his hands move again. Slow, steady, sweep, sweep. But the ground had shifted under him. And somewhere behind him a door he'd nailed shut a long time ago had just cracked open an inch. The video would be online by nightfall. And the man no one saw was about to be seen by millions. Priya Deshmukh did not set out to change a man's life. She set out to catch a bus. That was all. Friday evening rain coming down soft over the city, and she was standing under the awning outside her apartment, thumbing through her phone the way you do when you're tired, and the world is gray. And there it was, the video she'd shot that morning, sitting in a private chat with 3 friends from her program. Except it wasn't private anymore, because one of those friends had shared it. And that person's friend had shared it. And by the time Priya's bus splashed up to the curb, the little counter under the video had crossed 20,000, and it was still climbing, and her stomach did a slow, cold roll. The caption wasn't even hers. Someone had added it. Janitor fixes CEO's $3 million prototype like it's a toaster. She stood there in the rain and let the bus leave without her, because she knew the way you sometimes just know that she had started something she couldn't stop. By Saturday morning, it had crossed 50,000. By Sunday, it jumped to the professional networks where men and women in suits shared it with little sermons attached. This is why you respect every person on your payroll. Talent hides in plain sight. Somewhere a hiring manager is sweating. By Monday, Solomon Reed walked into a building that had changed overnight. He felt it before he understood it. The way the air felt different. People who had looked through him for years were suddenly looking at him. A software developer in the elevator actually turned and offered her hand. "Renata," she said, "that was really something. What you did with the car. Just a simple fix." He shook her hand anyway. Gentle, careful, simple. She almost laughed. "We had 3 people on that for weeks." The doors opened on 18, and she stepped out, and just before they closed, she turned back with a question in her mouth. "Where'd you learn to—" The doors cut her off. Solomon exhaled, alone again for one more floor. He'd spent years making sure nobody asked that question, and now it was following him into elevators. Priya, meanwhile, could not let it go. She was 24 and stubborn and finishing a master's in electrical engineering, and she came from a low line of people who worked with their hands. Her grandfather had been a machinist, had come home every night smelling of cut steel and pride. She had learned young that the man in the coveralls often knew things the man in the corner office only pretended to. So the janitor who fixed a car in 30 seconds was to her a puzzle worth losing sleep over. She started with HR. A woman named Marlene, who barely looked up. "Solomon, he's been here 5 years maybe, keeps to himself, reliable. That's about all I know." She tried the security desk. Gus on his coffee break. "Good man, never late, makes the best cornbread you ever tasted, brings it in every Christmas." But before Halcyon, what did he do before, Gus thought. Shrugged. Never talks about it. He's just Solomon, you know, does the job. Goes home. He's just Solomon. Everyone said it the same way, like the sentence had a period built into it. Like there was nothing on the other side of that name. But Priya had seen his hands move, and hands like that came from somewhere. So she stopped asking people, and she started asking the internet. At first nothing. No profile. No trail. A man who had scrubbed himself off the face of the connected world. Which only made her dig harder, because who does that? Who erases themselves on purpose? She tried the academic databases, engineering journals, old conference records, typed the name into a search box that indexed 30 years of published research, and hit enter, and waited. And there it was. A paper, 1996, Adaptive Decision Architectures in Autonomous Navigation. Author, Solomon J. Reed, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Priya stopped breathing for a second. She clicked, and clicked again, and the papers kept coming. Patents, keynotes, a young professor at the front of a field that wouldn't have a name for another decade. Solomon Reed had been writing about machines that could think machines, that could learn to drive themselves back when the rest of the world still thought self-driving cars were cartoons. He hadn't just worked in this field. He had helped invent it. And then, around 2003, the trail simply stopped. No more papers, no more patents, no farewell, no final lecture. A brilliant mind that had been broadcasting on every frequency for 8 years just went dark, like a star winking out. People don't vanish like that. Not by accident. So Priya kept pulling the thread, and the thread led her to a newspaper archive. A story from the spring of 2003, buried in the business section, the kind of story that runs once and disappears. Whistleblower claims safety warnings ignored at Meridian Dynamics. Priya's mouth went dry, because she knew that name now. Everyone who'd been paying attention that morning in the parking lot knew that name, though most had already forgotten hearing it. Weston Hale had thrown it at Solomon's back like a stone. The article didn't name the whistleblower. It protected the source the way papers do. But it described an engineer, a senior man who had raised alarms about an artificial intelligence guidance system being rushed to market. A man who said the safeguards weren't ready, that corners were being cut to hit a deadline, that someone was going to get hurt, and the dates matched. The disappearance matched. The silence matched. Priya sat in the blue glow of her laptop at 2 a.m. and felt the whole shape of it settle over her like a shadow. The janitor pushing a cart through the halls of Halcyon Systems had once tried to warn the world about exactly the kind of technology this company was now trying very hard to build. And the world had made him pay for it. The next afternoon, she found him cleaning the tall lobby windows' methodical squeegee, moving in long, clean strokes, and she came up beside him with her heart going too fast. "Mr. Reed." He didn't stop. "Something wrong with the elevators again." "No, it's about—" She swallowed. "It's about MIT and Meridian Dynamics." The squeegee stopped. For a long moment he just looked at his own reflection in the wet glass. An older man in a Navy uniform holding a tool, holding still. Then he nodded once toward a quiet corner of the lobby, away from the reception desk, and the ears that lived there. They stood by a potted fig tree, and Priya, who had rehearsed this a dozen times, forgot every word of it. So she just said it plain. "You were a professor. You published papers on learning systems 20 years before anybody else was thinking that way. And now you're here cleaning windows." She spread her hands helpless. "What happened to you?" Solomon was quiet a long time. When he spoke, his voice was low, and even the voice of a man who had told this story to no one and had almost forgotten how. "I had a brother," he said. "Marcus. He was younger, sharper than me in some ways. He worked at Meridian testing a guidance system, a thing I had already stood up in a room and said wasn't ready." He paused. His jaw worked. "The safeguards weren't enough. I told them. I put it in writing. They told me to mind the deadline." Priya didn't dare speak. "There was an accident," Solomon said, "during a test. And Marcus—" He stopped. The word wouldn't come. He didn't force it. He just let the silence say it for him. 2 decades gone, and the silence still said it perfectly. "He didn't make it?" Solomon finished quiet. "So you went public," Priya whispered. "I went public, showed them the memos, showed them exactly which corners got cut and who signed off on cutting them." A thin, tired smile. Back then, a company's good name mattered more than a man's dead brother. They closed ranks, and they made sure I never worked in this industry again. They blackballed you. Every door in the field, shut, one after another. He looked down at the squeegee in his hand, at the honest, simple work of it. After a while, a man stops knocking. You take what you can get. You learn to be quiet. You learn to be... He searched for the word. Invisible, Priya said. His eyes came up to meet hers, and something in them was grateful and sorrowful all at once. You catch on quick, Miss Deshmukh. Priya, please. Priya. He said it like he was filing it somewhere safe. She had one more question, and it was the one that had kept her up for 2 nights. But why here, of all the places? Why a technology company? Why work inside the exact thing they took from you? And for the first time, the smile that touched his face was real. Small but real. Because I still love it, he said simply. Even from the sidelines. Even with a mop in my hand. I get to walk past the future every night while it sleeps. He shrugged. A man can love the work without needing his name on it. Priya felt something press hot behind her eyes, and blinked it down. Because it was the saddest and most dignified thing she had ever heard a person say. Their moment broke apart against a commotion by the front desk. Weston Hale was crossing the lobby, like weather, 2 IT staffers scrambling in his wake, and his voice was tight and furious. I want it gone. Every copy, every repost, every trace. Are you hearing me? He stopped when he saw them. Saw the janitor and the intern standing together in the corner, heads close clearly. Talking about something. His eyes narrowed to something cold. You. He pointed at Solomon. My office. Now. And the whole lobby went quiet. The way a room goes quiet. When the powerful man raises his voice, everyone's suddenly very interested in their own shoes. Solomon set the squeegee down on the cart. Unhurried. He wiped his hands on a rag, folded it, laid it in its place. Then he looked at Priya, and the look said, It's all right. This was always coming. And he walked toward the elevator, toward the 40th floor, toward the man who had thrown his brother's grave in his face, without even knowing what he'd done. 15 minutes later, Solomon stood before a desk the size of a small boat, with the whole city spread out gray and endless behind the glass. Weston didn't offer him a seat. That video, Weston said, has been seen over 1 million times. The board has been calling me all weekend. Solomon said nothing. They want to know why a man with a mop can fix what my engineers can't. They're questioning my judgment, my talent, my whole operation. He leaned forward, both fists on the desk. So I had someone look into you, after that stunt with the car. Still Solomon said nothing, but his heartbeat found his ears. Solomon J. Reed. Weston said the full name, slowly tasting it, the last name that Solomon's own uniform wasn't allowed to carry. MIT Meridian Dynamics. A pause sharp as a blade. You're the one who tried to torch that company 20 years ago. The whistleblower. I told the truth, Solomon said. That's all. You cost people their jobs, their stock, their reputations. Weston straightened, and there was something ugly and frightened underneath the anger now, though Solomon couldn't yet see the whole shape of it. And now, you turn up scrubbing floors in my building and making me look like a fool on the internet. I never asked for the video, sir. I don't care what you asked for. Weston came around the desk, slow, until he stood too close. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to fix one more thing for me. A real thing. There's a core algorithm in our self-learning vehicle that stalled my whole team for months." He smiled, and there was no warmth in it, only a trap being set. "Fix that, and I'll triple your pay." It was a dare. Solomon could hear it plain. The car had been a fluke, a party trick, and Weston was betting his whole wounded pride that the janitor couldn't do it twice. Solomon considered the man in front of him for a long moment. And what Weston didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that Solomon had spent years of quiet nights looking at that exact kind of problem in a worn leather notebook, and that the thing they were building upstairs was a cruder, clumsier cousin of a dream he had once shared with a brother who never got to see it finished. "I'll need the real schematics," Solomon said finally. "Not the simple ones your people use for slideshows." Weston blinked. He hadn't expected an answer at all, let alone that one. "And I want the intern in the room. Deshmukh." "The intern? Why?" "Because she asks good questions." Solomon held his gaze. "Better than most of the people you pay to." A muscle jumped in Weston's jaw, but he nodded curt. "Fine. Tomorrow, 9 a.m., main lab. You'll have your schematics and your assistant." He turned back to the window, done with him. "But when you fail, and you go back to your mop, and you stay there. No more videos. No more playing engineer." Solomon walked to the door. "One more thing, Reed." Weston didn't turn around. "The whole board is watching now. Don't embarrass me again." Solomon paused with his hand on the door. And for the first time, a small, private smile crossed his face, one that Weston, staring out at his city, never saw. "Wouldn't dream of it," Solomon said. And he went down to the maintenance closet that served as his break room, and he sat alone under the bare bulb, and he took out the worn leather notebook he never let anyone see. He opened it to a page filled with his own handwriting and his brother's rougher scrawl in the margins. Ideas the two of them had chased across a garage floor a lifetime ago. His phone buzzed. A text from Priya. "Just heard. Tomorrow. What's the plan?" Solomon looked at the notebook. At Marcus's handwriting. At a dream that had been waiting a long time for someone to finish it. And he typed 4 words. "Time to remember who I was." Morning light came through the glass walls of the Halcyon lab in Wungpul bars, and Solomon Reed walked into a room that had never once expected to see him standing up straight. He'd been in here before. Only at night. Only with a mop and a story about checking the vents and the night guard who'd stopped believing that story years ago and let him in anyway. He knew this room in the dark. The hum of the servers. The blue glow of the monitors left running. The half-built machines waiting patient on their benches like sleeping animals. But he had never seen it like this. Full of daylight, full of people, and every one of those people stopped what they were doing when he came through the door. Because word had traveled. Of course it had. The whole building knew. And here he was, the man from the video in his Navy uniform, with the one-word name patch, standing in the temple where he was never allowed to worship. Priya was already there. She'd come in early to set up a workstation, and she stood when she saw him, and she said it loud enough for the whole room to hear. "Morning, Mr. Reed." The respect in her voice was a small, deliberate flag planted in enemy ground. "Just Solomon's fine," he said, quiet. A tall engineer with silver at his temples crossed the room, hand already extended. Gerald Pike, 30 years in the field, the kind of man who remembered things. "Dr. Reed," he said, and the title landed in the room like a stone in still water. "I read your paper on predictive decision layers in graduate school. It changed the way I think about the whole problem." Solomon shook the offered hand. He hadn't been called doctor in a very long time. He'd almost forgotten the weight of it. "That was years ago," he said. "Good work doesn't have a shelf life," Gerald said. And he meant it. Before Solomon could answer, the doors opened again, and the temperature dropped. Weston Hale came in, flanked by 2 executives, and the look on his face made it clear this was not the welcome he had planned. He'd expected the janitor to slink in and be quietly humiliated. He had not expected Gerald Pike shaking the man's hand like he was greeting a legend. "Let's get started," Weston said too loud. "I don't have all day for this experiment." Gerald stepped back, but not before he gave Solomon a small nod. The kind of nod one professional gives another. The kind of thing Solomon hadn't received in so long, he'd forgotten to expect it. On the conference table lay the schematics. The real ones, as promised, printed large, along with a stack of tablets. Weston gestured at them with the impatience of a man showing a child something too complicated for it. "The algorithm governs the vehicle's self-learning," he said. "Specifically, its decision-making under unexpected road conditions. It's been failing for months." His tone made clear he expected the words themselves to sail right over Solomon's head. Solomon picked up the top schematic, and the room watched him read. More than 2 decades since he'd stood in a proper lab. But the language of the thing came back to him the way a first language comes back, not word by word. All at once, his eyes moved down the diagram, and something behind them woke up something that had been sleeping under a long silence of floor wax and bare bulbs. "You've got a recursion problem," he said. Weston snorted. "We know that. That's what you're supposedly here to fix." Solomon didn't rise to it. He laid 3 schematics side by side on the table, lining up the edges with the care of a man dealing cards. "It's not just recursion," he said. "Your system's building data loops, feeding its own conclusions back into the decision matrix without filtering them first, which means at low speed it hesitates." He looked up, and at high speed it would keep second-guessing itself until it lost control. Someone could get hurt. The room went very still. A young engineer in a college sweatshirt standing near the back said under his breath, but not quite under enough. "That's exactly what I've been saying for months." Weston's face flushed a shade darker. "We know the theoretical risks," he snapped. "What we need is a solution, not more people telling me what's wrong." Solomon nodded, calm as still water. He turned to Priya and gestured at the workstation. "May I?" For the next hour he worked. And he did the thing that no one in that room had expected least of all Weston. He didn't just work. He taught. His fingers moved across the keyboard with a fluency that should not have belonged to a man who spent his days pushing a cart, and as he worked, he explained. To Priya, to the room which had begun one engineer at a time to drift closer. "I see here," he said, pointing at a block of code. "They've made the safety protocols too clever. Too many layers all firing at once, all shouting over each other." He traced a line. "Sometimes the simplest thing is the right thing. You put a small delay in the feedback loop. Just a breath. And in that breath, the system gets time to check its own work before it acts." Priya leaned in, and her questions were sharp, and Solomon answered every one like it deserved answering. "So instead of processing everything at once," she said slowly, "you're building a priority, a hierarchy. It solves the most important thing first." Exactly. And there it was. The professor breaking through the janitor's quiet like sun through cloud. In a critical system, you don't solve every problem at once. You solve the right problem in the right order. The rest can wait a breath. The young engineers were fully gathered now, taking notes, The ones who'd walked in skeptical were the ones writing fastest. And Weston saw his room turning, saw the audience forming around a man in a janitor's uniform. And he stepped forward and cut across it. "While this little classroom session is very touching," he said, "some of us have actual work to do." Solomon didn't take the bait. He looked up, mild. "Miss Deshmukh learns quickly," he said. "She's got good instincts." He turned to Priya, and his voice dropped, and what he said next he said only to her, though the whole room heard it. "Trust those. Even when the room tells you you're wrong. Especially then." Weston walked out, and came back 20 minutes later with the chief technology officer, a nervous man named Curtis, and the two of them stood in the corner speaking low and glancing often at Solomon. Priya's phone buzzed. A message from a friend in IT. "Heads up. Hale just told us to cut Reed's access. Read only on everything that matters. He wants it locked down now." She showed the screen to Solomon, and she watched his face waiting for the anger, the wounded pride, the outrage of a man being sabotaged in the middle of the very rescue he'd been ordered to perform. None of it came. Solomon read the message, nodded once, like he'd been expecting exactly this, like he'd known it before he ever walked in the door. "Expected that," he said. "But," Priya's voice dropped to a furious whisper, "how are you supposed to fix anything with no access? He's setting you up to fail." And Solomon smiled. A slow, deep smile, the smile of a man who had just been handed the one thing he understood better than anyone alive. Limitation. "Sometimes," he said, "limitation is where the creativity lives." He reached across the table, past the locked-down tablets, past the workstation they'd just crippled, and he pulled toward him a single blank sheet of paper. "Before there were computers," he said, "we designed these systems with a pencil and a steady hand." He picked up a pencil from the tray, turned it in his fingers like an old friend. "Let's go back to the beginning." And Weston, watching from the corner, felt the first cold finger of doubt. Because you cannot lock a man out of a sheet of paper. What followed was 3 hours the people in that lab would talk about for the rest of their careers. Solomon Reed sat at the head of the table with a pencil and a stack of blank paper and the printed schematics they hadn't thought to take away. And he did by hand what the whole department had failed to do with a server farm, where the engineering team had been piling complexity on complexity, trying to teach the machine a rule for every situation the world could ever throw at it. Solomon stripped it all away. Back to the bones. Back to the elegant, terrifying simplicity of the original idea. "The beauty is in the simple thing," he told Priya, sketching, as he spoke, the diagrams flowing out of him, clean and sure. "They're trying to write a rule for every possible moment. But you can't. There are infinite moments. It's impossible." He looked up at her. "So you don't build a machine that knows every answer. You build a machine that can learn the right answer. Safely. On its own. In the moment." Priya watched the pages fill and felt like she was watching someone paint. "You were doing this in the 90s, she said, wonder in her voice. "I was doing this when most people thought artificial intelligence meant robots in the movies." A pause. Not bitter, just true. "I was a long way ahead of the road." He gave a small, tired laugh. "And look where the road took me." He didn't say it with self-pity. He said it the way a man reports the weather, and somehow that made it land harder. Around the middle of the afternoon, he set down the pencil. I had it. A complete solution. Not a patch over the recursion problem, but a reimagining of the whole decision. Framework, one clean, elegant modification that made everything downstream of it simpler, faster, safer. It fit on 2 sheets of paper. 2 sheets of paper from a man they'd locked out of the computers. "Ready to test it?" he asked Priya. She nodded, and there was excitement under her professional calm, and she could barely keep it down. She loaded his design into the simulation herself, keying it in from his handwritten pages while he read the logic aloud. And Weston, who had returned to watch the failure he was so sure was coming, had arranged for the whole thing to run on the big lab display. Public, so everyone could see the janitor's party trick fall apart on the largest screen in the building. The engineers gathered. The simulation began. On the screen, a virtual version of the prototype car appeared at the start of a testing course, and the course was brutal. Sudden obstacles, failing light, road conditions that changed without warning. The exact scenarios that had in every previous test made the AI freeze or overcorrect or drive itself straight into a wall. The car moved, and it moved differently. Where the old system had hesitated, this one flowed. Where the old system had panicked, this one chose. It read the road, prioritized, acted all in the fraction of a breath that Solomon had built into the feedback loop. It handled the sudden obstacles like they were nothing. It navigated the failing light. It moved with something that looked uncomfortably almost like confidence. Almost like a person who knew what they were doing. And then came the final test. The one that had crashed the system every single time. An emergency obstacle appearing with no warning, forcing an instant choice. The virtual car slowed, assessed, and threaded a path between the hazards that no one on the engineering team had ever programmed because Solomon hadn't programmed a path. He'd built a mind that could find one. The simulation completed. Green across the board. For one heartbeat, the lab was silent. And then it erupted. Spontaneous applause. Real applause, the kind that comes up out of people before they've decided to give it. Gerald Pike shook his head slowly, staring at the screen. "He did it," Gerald said. "One day. It took him one day." Priya was grinning so hard, it hurt. And Solomon sat back in his chair, and for one moment, one warm and unguarded moment, the weight of all those years fell off his shoulders, and he was just a man who had solved a beautiful problem and gotten to watch it work. Weston Hale's face was a war between 2 feelings. Relief that the thing was fixed, and a rising, choking fury that it had been fixed by the man he'd tried so hard to break. He forced his mouth into something like a smile. "Promising preliminary results," he said loud over the applause. "We'll need extensive validation, of course." Of course. And in the celebration, Priya slipped out to refill her coffee. And in the break room, she heard 2 IT technicians talking low over their phones, and what she heard stopped her cold. "Hale wants the access logs for Reed's whole session. Every keystroke. Why, the guy just saved the project. Above my pay grade, but the email said, and I'm quoting, document, that he had no full access. And then..." The technician lowered his voice. "Don't give him anything. Let him fail." "I wanted him to fail." "Sure sounds like it. Guy fixes it anyway with a pencil, and now the boss wants a paper trail, proving he shouldn't have been able to." Priya stood very still with her empty coffee cup, and the warm glow of the last hour curdled into something hard and cold in her chest. She walked back into the lab, and she found Weston there standing among the engineers, congratulating them. The engineers, on their collaborative problem-solving, on the team's breakthrough. Not one word about the man who'd actually done it. Not one. "Mr. Hale." Her voice was steadier than her hands. A word. He followed her to a quiet corner, impatient. What is it, intern? I'm busy. I know you cut his access. She kept her voice low, but every word was a nail. I know you wanted him to fail, and he fixed your car anyway with a pencil and a piece of paper. Weston's face went hard. Be very careful, Miss Deschmuke. Those are serious accusations against your CEO. I have the email, sir. For just a second, real fear flickered across his face before he buried it. He stepped closer, lowering his voice into something almost gentle, which was so much worse. You want to know how this works? Temporary interns who pick fights with executives don't have careers here, or anywhere I can reach. He straightened his cuffs. Remember your place. And he walked away. Priya stood there shaking, but she wasn't done, and she said it to his back loud enough to carry. He fixed it with a pencil. What does that tell you about who really belongs in that lab? Weston didn't turn around, but his shoulders stiffened, and she saw it land. Across the room, Solomon was surrounded by engineers now. Young ones, mostly the ones who'd been taking notes, and they were asking him questions, real questions, and he was answering, and for a few minutes the room had rearranged itself around the truth of who he was. Priya crossed to him, and quietly, so only he could hear, she told him. About the access, about the email, about let him fail. And she watched the light go out of him, not dramatically. That wasn't his way. It was quieter than that. The warmth that had been in his face during the celebration simply drained away, and in its place came something older and more tired. The patient acceptance of a man who had been reminded one more time exactly where he stood. I think I'm done here, he said softly. What? Priya's stomach dropped. But you solved it. Everyone saw. Everyone knows what you can do now. Solomon shook his head slowly. They don't want me here, Priya. Not really. He began to gather his things. The 2 sheets of paper, the worn leather notebook he'd brought, and never quite needed. A man can fix their machine, save their project, and they'll still cut his access and hope he drowns. He tucked the notebook into his coat. I was never really back, was I? Mr. Reed. But he was already moving toward the door. The engineers saw him going. Gerald Pike stepped forward, confused. Dr. Reed, where are you going? Solomon stopped at the elevator. He turned, and he gave Gerald a small, gentle smile, the last thing he'd give any of them. Just Solomon's fine, he said, and I'm going home. The doors opened. He stepped in, and Priya stood in the middle of that lab, surrounded by the stunned faces of people who had just watched a genius walk out of a room they'd spent months telling him he didn't belong in, and she felt something turn over inside her. Not sadness, past sadness. Resolve. Because they had tried to make him invisible one more time, and she was done letting them. Solomon Reed had disappeared before. He was good at it. 3 days, and the maintenance closet stood empty. The Navy uniform hung neat on its hook. The name Patch face out, one word. Solomon, like a question no one had ever finished asking. His ID badge lay on the shelf beside it, placed there. Careful the way you set down something you've decided you no longer need. His apartment on the south side sat dark. Mail piling in the box. A man who had spent a lifetime learning how to vanish had simply done it again, and the world he'd briefly lit up went on turning without him. Except Priya Deschmuke would not let it turn, because she had watched them try to erase a good man one more time, and something in her had gone from soft to iron. She spent 2 days not sleeping, 2 days building a file. access logs, email threads, the simulation results. The whole ugly architecture of a sabotage laid out clean, the way Solomon himself would have laid out a schematic. Evidence you could not argue with. And on the third morning, she made a decision that would burn every bridge she had. She waited until noon, until the cafeteria was full, until the whole building was watching its own lunch, and then she opened her laptop, and she pointed her phone camera at her own face, and she pressed the little red circle that ends careers, or starts revolutions, and sometimes both. "My name is Priya Deshmukh," she said. Her voice shook, and she let it. "I'm an engineering intern at Halcyon Systems. 3 days ago, a man named Solomon Reed solved a problem this company's engineers had been failing to solve for months. He did it in a single day. With a pencil. After my CEO deliberately locked him out of the computers and told his own staff, and I'm quoting, to let him fail." Somewhere in the cafeteria, a fork stopped moving. For 15 minutes, she walked the internet through it. Calm, precise, the before and the after, the broken system and the elegant fix. She never once said the word sabotage. She didn't have to. The email said it for her right there on the screen. Black letters on white, "Don't give him anything. Let him fail." And then she looked into the camera and said the thing that would spread across the country by nightfall. This man wasn't an executive. He wasn't even an engineer here. He was our janitor. A breath. And now he's gone. Because some people would rather bury a genius than admit they never bothered to see one. She ended the stream. And the internet did what the internet does, because there is a story that people never get tired of. The story of the overlooked one. The story of the person we walked past 1,000 times, invisible, in their uniform, who turned out to be carrying something the rest of us couldn't dream of. It is an old story. It is maybe the oldest story. And here, it was alive with a name and a face and a pencil. By 2 o'clock, the clip had been shared thousands of times. By 4, it had jumped to the news blogs. CEO tried to bury Janitor's genius. By 6, it was on the evening broadcasts, and financial analysts were saying words like leadership crisis, and the stock ticked down, and then it slid, and then it fell. And in a small apartment, 300 miles away, an old television flickered. Because Solomon hadn't gone far. He'd driven north to Milwaukee, to Isaiah, his brother's son, 23, now with Marcus's eyes, and Marcus's stubborn jaw, finishing up a degree, and dreaming the same dangerous dreams that ran in the family blood. Solomon had needed to be near the only piece of Marcus left in the world. And now he sat in Isaiah's cramped living room, watching his own name scroll across a news crawl, and he felt something he had no name for. Not pride. Pride was too simple. It was closer to fear. The fear of a man who had built a fortress out of being unseen, watching the walls come down. "Uncle Solomon," Isaiah's voice quiet. "You're famous." "I don't want to be famous." "I know." Isaiah sat down beside him. "But maybe you don't get to pick anymore." His phone had been buzzing for hours. Dozens of messages. He'd ignored most of them, but one from Priya he read 3 times. "I'm sorry if I made it worse. But you deserved to be seen, and they deserved to be caught." He was still trying to figure out how to answer that when the knock came. A courier, an envelope, a logo he didn't recognize. And Solomon stood in Isaiah's doorway and opened it and read the letter inside twice because the words didn't make sense the first time. An invitation to speak. At a technology summit on the coast, all expenses paid as a featured innovator. As if the word innovator had ever been allowed to sit next to his name again. He set the letter down on Isaiah's coffee table, and he looked at it for a long time. Because public speaking had never been his gift, not even in the classroom years, and the thought of standing before a room full of the very people who'd shut every door in his face and asking them to look at him now made something in his chest go tight and cold. He drove home to Chicago late that night, and the next morning there was a second knock. And when he opened his door, no one was there. Only a small, elegant box on the step, a note tucked under the ribbon in handwriting he didn't know. A promise is a promise. Something went strange in his chest. He walked out to the curb, and there it was, the silver prototype, the car from the parking lot, the machine that had started all of it gleaming in the morning light of his working-class street, so out of place among the modest homes and the chain-link fences that a small crowd of neighbors had already gathered to stare. His phone rang, an unknown number. A woman's voice, crisp and careful. "Mr. Reed, Margaret Ashford. I chair the board at Halcyon Systems." A pause. "I hope our gift arrived safely." It did. He was still looking at the car. A car that cost more than his whole street. "Consider it the first installment of an apology, Mr. Reed." Her voice softened just slightly. "The board would like to discuss proper compensation for your work, and if you're willing something more lasting, a real relationship, on your terms." "I appreciate that, Ms. Ashford." He watched a child from down the block press her nose to the silver window. "But I'm not sure I have any interest in going back to corporate America." "I understand." And she sounded for a bored air, almost human. "But the door is open. Whenever you're ready, it will stay open." He ended the call. And he stood beside a machine worth millions on a street where nothing was worth millions, and the contrast was not lost on him. Or on the little girl, still peering through the glass. "That really yours, Mr. Reed?" He looked down at her. Danny, from 3 doors down. 12 years old and afraid of nothing. "Apparently so," Solomon said. "How'd you get it?" And he considered the question the way he considered everything. Slow, careful, honest. "By fixing something," he said, "that other people couldn't." The letter on the coffee table would not leave him alone. The summit. The coast. And what he didn't know, what he wouldn't learn until he was already there, was that the invitation had a name behind it that would break his heart open. He almost didn't go. He nearly folded the letter into a drawer and let the whole thing pass the way he'd let so many things pass. But Isaiah on the phone said the thing that decided it. Dad would have gone Uncle Solomon. Not for the applause, for the chance to say the thing out loud, finally. So he went. The summit was on the coast in a hotel with more glass than a man could clean in a year. And the auditorium was full, and Solomon stood backstage in a borrowed suit that fit him wrong, and felt the old fear crawl up his spine. All those faces, all that light, the red eyes of the cameras. And then a man came around the corner of the backstage curtain, and Solomon went completely still, because he knew that face. Older now, silver at the temples, lined in a way the years will line a man. But he knew it. Julian Frost, the best student Solomon had ever taught, the sharpest mind he'd ever mentored. The young man who had stood beside him at Meridian Dynamics, who had shared the dream, who had understood the work better than anyone alive, and who had sat in a hearing room, young and terrified and ambitious, and testified that Solomon's warnings were theoretical, excessive, overblown. Julian Frost had put his hand on the truth and pushed it under the water and held it there to save his own career. And now here he was, standing 3 feet away, his eyes wet. "Hello, Solomon," Julian said. Solomon said nothing. 2 decades of nothing rose up in his throat. "I saw the story." Julian's voice cracked around the edges. "I've been trying to find the words for 20 years. I never could. But He stopped, started again. "You were right. And I was a coward. And I have carried it every single day." "You could have called," Solomon said. "Flat, cold. Any day in 20 years you could have called." "I know. Marcus is dead, Julian." Julian flinched like he'd been struck. "I know that too. God, I know that." He pressed the heel of his hand to his eyes. "I have a company now, Apex Vector. I have resources, power, everything I sold my soul to get." A bitter laugh. "And I would give all of it back to have said the right thing in that room." A voice from the wings called Solomon's name. They were ready for him. Julian caught his arm as he turned. "Come work with me. Let me give you what I took. Your own lab. Your own terms. Please, let me make it right." And Solomon looked at the hand on his arm. The hand of the boy he had loved like a son. The hand that had betrayed him. "I have to go," he said. And he pulled free. And he walked out onto the stage. The applause was a wall of sound, and it did not stop. And Solomon stood at the podium and waited for it to break like a wave. He set aside the notes he'd written. He looked out at the sea of faces. The executives, the engineers, the reporters, the very industry that had cast him out. And he spoke from the place the notes couldn't reach. 20 years ago, he said, I lost everything for telling the truth about a technology that wasn't ready. A technology that valued speed over safety, and a man's life over a deadline. The room went silent. Utterly. I became invisible. Not by accident. On purpose. Because it was easier to disappear than to keep knocking on doors that would never open. His voice gained something. Not volume, weight. And I spent those years watching, learning, fixing the things nobody else noticed. Not because it was my job, because that's who I am. It's who I've always been. He gripped the edges of the podium. This is not about me being right. I'd trade being right in a heartbeat for one more morning with my brother. A breath. The room breathed with him. This is about remembering why we build these things in the first place. To serve people, not shareholders. It's about the dignity of a man's work, whether he does it in a corner office or pushing a broom down an empty hall at midnight. Somewhere in the audience a woman was crying. Brilliant minds are everywhere, Solomon said. In every room, behind every counter, under every uniform, we've trained ourselves not to look at twice. The mind doesn't care what you wear. It doesn't care what title you hold or don't. It just needs someone, anyone, to believe in it again. The silence held one more heartbeat. And then the room came to its feet, all of it at once, and the sound they made was not polite applause. It was something rawer. It went on for nearly 5 minutes, and hardened industry men wiped their eyes, and Solomon stood in the light he had spent half his life hiding from, and let himself be seen. By morning, the clip had gone everywhere. Silent brilliance, the headlines called it. The narrative that had started as scandal had become something else. A parable, a reckoning, and Halcyon's board that same morning formally asked Weston Hale to resign, because the video had done what videos do, and the board had done what boards do, when the stock is bleeding and the story has turned, and they had also quietly been shown the rest of it. The access logs, the sabotage, and other things, older things, patterns of the way Weston Hale had treated the people he'd decided were beneath him. The whole ugly shape of it. Weston Hale was gone by the end of the week, but Solomon barely noticed, because he was sitting in his apartment days later, surrounded by boxes he'd pulled from beneath his bed boxes, full of the man he used to be, when an email arrived. And the address on it stopped him where he sat. It was from Julian. The subject line read simply "overdue," and attached to it was a document. And Solomon opened it and read it, and had to set the phone down and press his hand flat against the table to steady himself, because it was the transcript, the old hearing, and it was marked up, annotated line by line in Julian's own words, 20 years too late, correcting every lie he had told. This was false. I knew it was false. Solomon Reed was right about this. Solomon Reed warned us about exactly this in writing 4 months prior. A confession, a full and formal confession signed, dated the kind of thing that could be filed, that could reopen a case that everyone had agreed to forget. And at the bottom, one line. I can't give you back your brother, but I can give you back the truth. It was always yours. Solomon sat alone in the yellow light of his kitchen, surrounded by the artifacts of a stolen life. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he wept. Not from grief. He'd done grief. He'd lived in grief. This was something else. This was the specific, unbearable ache of a wound you'd stopped believing could ever close. Being touched at last by the one hand that could close it. He wept for Marcus. He wept for the young professor he'd been. He wept for all the mornings he'd swept a floor when he could have been building the future. And when he was done, he wiped his face, and he picked up the phone, and he read Julian's confession one more time. And here is the thing about Solomon Reed, the thing that made him who he was. He did not think about revenge. He did not think about the case. He could reopen the men. He could ruin the vindication. He could finally, publicly claim. He thought it about a terrified young man in a hearing room. He thought about the weight that boy had carried for 2 decades. He thought about how heavy a lie gets when you drag it that long. And he typed back 4 words. Thank you, Julian. Rest. Because forgiveness, Solomon had learned, was not a gift you gave the other person. It was a weight you finally set down for yourself. His phone rang. Priya. He answered, and her voice came through breathless, worried. Solomon, Julian Frost, Apex Vector. I've been reading about them. They're not clean. Industrial espionage ethics violations, the whole... She caught herself. He's going to use you, your name, to wash all of it. Please don't let him. And Solomon looked at the confession, glowing on his screen. The truth handed back to him with no conditions at all. He already gave me the only thing I ever wanted from him, Solomon said quietly. And it wasn't a job. What was it? He was quiet a moment. The truth, he said. Just the truth. And outside his window, on a working-class street, where nothing was supposed to be worth millions, the silver machine caught the last of the afternoon light. The machine he'd fixed with 30 seconds and a lifetime of knowing. The machine that carried, buried deep in its code, a dream 2 brothers had chased across a garage floor when the world was young and the future still belonged to them. Because that was the thing no one had ever understood. Not Weston, not the board, not even Julian, the algorithm at the heart of that car. The elegant, impossible thing that made it move like it was almost alive. had never been in any file they could steal or lock away. It had been in his notebook, and his notebook had been in his heart, and you cannot lock a man out of his own heart, no matter how many doors you close. The Nevada desert stretched flat and gold to the edge of the world, and somewhere in the middle of it, a silver car was about to make its case. Solomon Reed sat in the passenger seat watching the horizon come up to meet them. Because he had said yes. After all of it. After the summit, after the confession, after the long weeks of choosing what kind of man he wanted to be for the rest of whatever time he had left. He had said yes to exactly one thing, and it wasn't the corner office, and it wasn't the millions, and it wasn't Julian's lab on the coast. It was this, a competition, a test track in the desert, and a promise to a brother who wasn't there to see it. Nervous? Priya asked from the back seat. She'd leaned forward to study the dashboard the way she always did now, like the machine might whisper her a secret if she got close enough. Not about the car, Solomon said. Because he wasn't. He'd stopped being nervous about the car a long time ago. The car was the one thing in his life he trusted completely. It was everything around the car that made his chest go tight. The National Autonomous Vehicle Challenge had drawn every serious name in the industry. Tech giants, startups with more money than sense, teams that had spent years and fortunes programming their machines for every scenario a desert could throw at them. And behind Solomon's car, a convoy of media vehicles kicked up dust cameras hungry for the story they'd all been chasing for months. The janitor who outsmarted the industry. Here, now, at the finish line of everything. Halcyon's new CEO had insisted on entering. Her name was Diane Marsh, promoted from within, after Weston Hale's fallen engineer, first and a suit second, which was exactly why the board had chosen her. It's not about winning, she'd told them all back in Chicago. It's about showing the world what ethical innovation actually looks like. And Solomon had built the car to prove her right, because he'd done something the other teams hadn't dared. While every competitor programmed their vehicle with a rulebook thick as a phone directory, a specific answer coded in for every possible danger, Solomon had done the opposite. He'd stripped it down. He'd given the machine the fewest rules he could, and the deepest ability to learn, and then he'd stepped back and trusted it. We set the foundation, he'd told the engineering team, and then we let it learn, with as little interference as we can manage. That's the whole point. To build something that can truly adapt. Some of the board had balked. Too risky, one had said. The other teams are programming for everything. And that, Solomon had answered, is exactly why they'll lose. You can't program for everything. There isn't enough time in the world. True intelligence isn't knowing every answer. He'd paused. It's what you do when you meet a question no one prepared you for. Now in the staging area, the machine hummed quietly beneath him, and Solomon put his hand flat on the dash, the way a man rests a hand on the shoulder of someone he loves. All right, brother, he said, too quiet for the others to hear. Let's show them. The head judge's voice rolled out over the loudspeakers, and it carried across the desert like a sermon. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the final stage. Today's course includes extreme terrain, simulated weather, unexpected obstacles, and complex decision scenarios. The vehicles will navigate with no human intervention, none. One by one, the machines departed, and one by one, they struggled. The first car handled the terrain well, and then drowned itself in a simulated flash flood sensors, screaming wheels spinning in fake water. The second made it further, and then froze completely when the course threw it an ethical scenario. a choice between striking debris and swerving into a barrier, and the machine sat there paralyzed, unable to choose, until the officials had to step in and pull it. The third, from a company with a name everyone knew, and a budget that could buy a small country, made it nearly to the end. And then it met the same scenario, and it chose the barrier, and it crashed itself trying to avoid a problem that a human driver would have solved without thinking. Solomon watched each one on the big screens in the observation area Priya beside him, and he said nothing. But his hands were folded tight in his lap, because these weren't just competitors. These were the exact philosophies that had killed his brother. Machines built to follow a rule book. Machines that panicked the moment the world stepped outside the lines someone had drawn for them. He had spent his whole second life learning why that was wrong, and now his answer was about to drive. "Halcyon Systems," the loudspeaker called, and the desert went quiet. The silver car pulled up to the start line, and even the reporters stopped talking. It sat there for a moment, sensors sweeping the terrain, gathering the world into itself. And then it moved, and from the very first yard it moved differently. The steep inclines, the loose gravel, the switchback turns that had thrown the other machines around like toys. The silver car took them all, with a fluid, unhurried grace, adjusting, flowing, reading the ground, the way a mountain goat reads a cliff face, not fast, not reckless, sure. "Look at it," a reporter breathed. Then came the weather zone. Artificial rain heavy enough to blind the sensors, visibility falling to almost nothing. The other cars had crawled through this. Some had stopped entirely defeated by the wall of water. The silver car slowed. But it did not stop. It adjusted its speed to the conditions and held its course steady as a heartbeat. "It's reading the road through the water," Priya whispered to the journalists gathered near, unable to keep the pride out of her voice. "The texture of it. It's changing which senses it trusts based on what it can rely on. It's prioritizing." And on the screen, the car came to the scenario. The one that had frozen one competitor and crashed another. Debris appearing without warning. A barrier on one side. A steep drop on the other. Two bad choices, and the whole industry had built machines that could only ever pick the least bad one. Solomon held his breath, because this was it. This was the moment his brother had died for. The moment when a machine meets the impossible and has to decide what kind of thing it's going to be. And the silver car did something that no one on that team had programmed. It slowed, instantly buying itself a fraction of a second that the rulebook machines never thought to buy. And then it threaded the needle. It found a path between the debris that shouldn't have existed, that no engineer had encoded that the machine invented on its own in the space of a breath. It didn't choose between two bad options. It created a third. It made its own way, Solomon whispered, and something broke open in his face, some warm and aching pride. Because that was the whole dream right there. That was the thing he and Marcus had chased across a garage floor half a lifetime ago. A machine that didn't just obey. A machine that could think its way toward mercy. But the desert wasn't done with them yet. Because as the silver car pressed on through the final stretch, another competitor's vehicle malfunctioned ahead of it on a narrow bridge section and stalled. Dead in the middle of the path. Warning lights flashing. Blocking the only way through. By the rules, this meant disqualification for the stalled car. And it meant the safety team would have to come clear it, which would cost the silver car precious time, maybe the whole competition. The crowd leaned in. This was where you won or lost. The silver car approached the stalled machine, and it slowed, and it stopped at a careful distance, and it seemed on the screens to be thinking. And then it did the thing that would be replayed 1,000,000 times by morning. It edged forward, gentle, deliberate, and it nudged the stalled vehicle softly, carefully to the side of the bridge, clearing the path, not just for itself, for anyone who came after. Did it just, a reporter's voice cracked, did it just help the other car? Solomon nodded slowly, and his eyes were wet, and he didn't care who saw. We gave it basic assistance protocols, he said, for helping people in trouble, but we never told it to do that. He shook his head, wonder and grief and pride all tangled together. It decided, on its own, that helping was the right thing to do, because that was the part he'd never been able to put in a rule book, the part you couldn't code, the part that had to be taught the way you teach a child by showing it over and over what mattered, and somehow impossibly the machine had learned it. The silver car crossed the finish line as the sun began to drop, completing every challenge, and the crowd was already on its feet, already roaring, already reaching for their phones. And by the time the official results were announced, the internet had a name for what it had seen. The empathy protocol. Halcyon Systems won, by a margin that wasn't even close. But the headlines the next morning weren't about winning. AI, vehicle shows empathy. Self-learning, car stops to help stranded rival. The future of ethical technology, built by a man they called a janitor. At the award ceremony, under a sky going purple and enormous, a woman from the Department of Transportation found Solomon in the crowd. She had a government badge and a careful voice. "We're assembling a council," she said, "to write the ethical standards for autonomous technology, the rules everyone will have to follow. We want you on it, Mr. Reed." Solomon looked at her for a long moment. "I'm not much for committees," he said. "We don't need another bureaucrat." She held out her card. "We need someone who remembers that this technology is supposed to serve people, not the other way around." A pause. "Think about it. It's not about regulations. It's about shaping what comes next." He took the card. He didn't say yes, but he didn't say no. That night, while the Halcyon team celebrated in a hotel that glittered against the desert, dark, Priya found Solomon alone on the terrace, looking up at more stars than the city ever let a man see. "Everyone's wondering where the guest of honor went," she said, settling beside him. "Just needed some quiet." He showed her the government card, turning it over in his fingers. "They want you to write the rules," Priya said. "Solomon, that's perfect. You'd be—" "I turned down the full-time seat." He said it gently, "but I told them I'd mentor some of their younger engineers." He smiled at the surprise on her face. "I'm done with institutions, Priya. Boardrooms, committees. My place isn't in a room full of important people arguing." He looked back up at the stars. "It's with the ones still figuring out who they're going to be." Priya was quiet a moment, then softly, "Speaking of the next generation, I have news too." He turned to her. "I'm leaving Halcyon, starting something of my own, a consulting firm, ethical technology design." She smiled, nervous and proud all at once. "We've already got 3 clients, including the Department of Transportation." "Sounds like you don't need an old man's mentorship anymore," Solomon said, and the pride in his voice was thick enough to touch. Priya shook her head. "That's not how it works." She looked at him, and her eyes were shining. "You didn't teach me to code, Solomon, or to engineer. I already knew that. You taught me the other thing, the thing that matters." A breath. You taught me how to stand in the truth, without apologizing for it, even when the whole room tells you you're wrong. And Solomon, who had spent so many years being told he was wrong, had to look away at the desert for a moment before he could answer. Especially then, he said. There were things Solomon needed to do before he could rest, and one of them was harder than all the rest. Because before he left Nevada, he'd made a request that surprised everyone who heard it. He'd asked to see Weston Hale. Weston was awaiting trial now on charges that had grown well beyond a single act of sabotage. The confession Julian had filed had cracked open old cases. Investigators had followed the cracks, and the whole rotten architecture of how certain men had cut certain corners across certain companies over certain years had begun to come down. Weston Hale was one of the men standing under it when it fell. They sat across from each other in a bare visiting room. Weston's expensive suit was gone, replaced by something plain and institutional, and the commanding presence that had once filled a 40th floor office had shrunk to fit the small, hard chair he sat in. "Why are you here?" Weston asked, suspicion in every word. "Come to gloat." "No," Solomon said simply. "I came to understand." Understand what? Solomon leaned forward slow, and there was no cruelty in his face, only a terrible patient sorrow. "You had everything," he said. "Education, wealth, position, power. Every door I ever knocked on you were born already standing inside." He shook his head. "And you spent all of it, every bit of it, trying to be more important than you were useful." Weston's face flushed. "You don't know anything about me. I know you looked at people and saw tools instead of talent." Solomon's voice stayed even, without a drop of malice in it. "I know you valued the title over the work, and I know you never once understood that the whole point, the entire point, is to look for the brilliance in the places nobody bothers to look." For a moment something cracked in Weston's face. Confusion, almost fear. "Why do you even care?" he said, quieter now. "You won. I lost. It's over." "Because your story matters too," Solomon said. He stood, as a warning if nothing else, and he walked out. He didn't look back, because there was nothing left in that room he needed. He had come to set down the last weight, and he had set it down, and now his hands were finally completely empty. Empty and open, ready to carry something new. Back in Chicago, in his old neighborhood on the South Side, there was a garage that had sat closed and cold for more than 20 years. It had been Marcus's garage once, the place where two brothers had bent over engines and dreamed too big. And Solomon had kept it all those years, paying the taxes on it, unable to sell it, unable to open it. A shrine to a life that ended. Now he opened the door, and he let the light in. With his settlement from Halcyon, with donated computers and simple tools, and the patient work of his own 2 hands, Solomon Reed turned his dead brother's garage into something alive. He called it the Reed Workshop, a place for the neighborhood kids, the ones nobody looked at twice, the ones the world had already decided weren't the kind of children who grew up to build the future. Twice a week they came, and twice a week engineers from Halcyon came too, volunteering their evenings, Gerald Pike first among them, teaching kids who'd never touched a circuit board how to make one sing. And on a warm evening in late spring, an envelope arrived at that workshop bearing a seal Solomon knew by heart. Isaiah drove down from Milwaukee to deliver it in person. He walked into the garage where his father had once dreamed, and he handed his uncle a letter, and his hands were shaking. Solomon opened it. An acceptance to the graduate engineering program at MIT, full scholarship. The same program where Solomon himself had once stood at the front of the room. His brother's son, walking back through the door that had been slammed on the whole family all those years ago. "I wanted it to be a surprise," Isaiah said, his voice thick. "But then you went and got famous." Solomon read the letter twice, and then he pulled his brother's son into his arms and held him, and neither of them said anything for a long time, because some things are too big for words. "Your father," Solomon finally managed, "would be so proud." "It's because of you," Isaiah said into his shoulder. "Not the recommendation. Everything else. Watching you stand up for what was right, even when it cost you everything you had." "No." Solomon pulled back, held the young man at arm's length, looked him in his father's eyes. "You earned this, on your own." "Maybe." Isaiah wiped at his face and almost laughed. "But when the other kids were giving up, saying math and science weren't for people like us, I remembered. I had an uncle who knew how to build thinking machines." He shrugged, helpless. "So I stayed." And Solomon understood then the thing it had taken him half his life to learn. That the work had never been the algorithm, or the car, or the patents, or the papers, or the name on the front of a building. The work had always been this. This boy, these neighborhood kids, this light let back into a dark garage. The rest was just machines. That summer, Halcyon Systems held a ceremony to rename their research building. Solomon didn't want the attention. He never had. But he agreed to come on one condition, and he told Diane Marsh exactly what it was. "I'll stand there and let you put my name on your building," he said. "If you open the doors to public school kids on the weekends, free, real equipment, real mentors, the children this city has already given up on." Diane agreed, or he'd even finished the sentence. And so on a bright morning, the Solomon Reed Innovation Center was dedicated. He spoke for less than a minute. He turned the attention fast as he could toward the students who would fill those halls. And Odessa Boyd was there in the front row, in her good dress, watching her friend with tears standing in her eyes and refusing to fall. Because she had been the only one for years who called him by his whole name. And now the whole world knew it, and she'd known it first. The next morning, before dawn, before anyone else arrived, Solomon came back to the center that bore his name. He carried a broom, and on the sidewalk in front of the building, under a sky just beginning to turn from black to gold, he swept. Not because he had to. God knows he never had to sweep anything again. But because his hands knew the motion, and the motion knew his heart, and there was a peace in it he'd found nowhere else in his long, strange life. A connection to all those years when his work had gone unseen, but had mattered anyway. Had always mattered. A young security guard watched from the doorway, baffled. "Mr. Reed," he called. "What are you doing? We have maintenance staff for that, sir." Solomon smiled and didn't stop sweeping. "Just finding my peace, son," he said. "Old habits." The guard nodded, still confused, and went back inside. And as the sun came up over the city, painting the glass tower gold, Solomon paused, leaned on his broom, and for one moment, one vivid, unbearable moment, he was young again, and Marcus was beside him in a garage full of tools and grease and impossible dreams. Both of them laughing, both of them certain the future belonged to them. He could almost hear his brother's laugh, almost feel the weight of a wrench in his hand, almost smell the motor oil. And then he was back. An old man with a broom watching a car he'd built with a pencil and a lifetime of love, move smoothly through the early morning traffic, carrying strangers safely home, guided by a mind that had learned somehow to be kind. That afternoon he visited his brother's grave. He knelt in the grass and brushed the leaves from the simple stone, and he set beside it a small model of the silver car, the one that had started as a mockery in a parking lot and become against everything a testament. "We did it, brother," he said softly. "Not the way we planned. Not when we hoped." His voice broke, and he let it. "But we did it." The wind moved through the grass. Somewhere a bird called, and Solomon Reed knelt there in the quiet, a forgotten genius who had been seen at last, and understood something that he wished he could go back and tell the frightened invisible man he used to be, that it is never too late to be seen, to matter, to begin again, that a life's worth does not expire, that the mind does not care what uniform you wear, and neither in the end does love, that the truest thing a person can build is not a machine at all, but a door held open for the one coming up behind them. They gave him a broom. He built a machine. They gave him silence, and he made it sing.